Can you tell us a little bit about the first 24 hours of COVID? What was that like? Because obviously we all saw it from our homes and the chaos, but being on the inside, what was that actually like?
And I talk a little bit about that in the book. So I was then the junior minister in the business department.
Yeah.
And I was pulled into a Cobra meeting, which was going to be a run through of how the nation would and what we would need to do.
Are you feeling excited or fearful in this moment?
At this moment, I was almost before entering the Cobra. I really sort of was just doing my job. It was one of several things I had to do that day, and it just said, we're going to do a run through of what would happen in the case of it was an influenza virus in this case. And so I walked in as the representative of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, and other ministers were in the room, and it was led by Matt Hancock and by Simon Stevens, who was Chief Executive of the NHS, and Chris Whitty. And the moment we went live, you had to sort of stop anything to do with the real world and pretend that actually we are now in the world of a virus that has taken over the country and is spreading and killing people, and that we're, the estimates are there'll be 500,000 people dead, and having to sort of think about, okay, who makes a decision as to who to treat in hospital, and we very quickly decided that it would be the clinicians who would have to. It can't be a politician making those trade-offs. What do we do about morgues? Do we build morgues in Hyde Park and the other parks? It was that sort of thing. What do you do about nuclear facilities? In my case, as the energy minister, what do you do about the markets? Do you shut down the markets? It was literally having to go through what each department would do. Same for the Minister of Transport, Minister of Defence, and so on. And I walked out of that meeting thinking, God, I wish this would never happen.
Yeah.
Little did I know that actually the Department of Health was already had an earlier
Already briefed.
Several meetings.
Yeah. But was everyone terrified?
So the next meeting was when we had to make the decision on the first lockdown. And I remember walking out of 70 Whitehall and heading towards Parliament Square, and just looking around me. I don't know whether you guys remember, there's a sort of say, we're about to lock the nation down. And I was looking at thousands of people, right, walking into down the steps into Westminster tube station. And that is when I was really frightened. I thought, how are we going to tell these people, right, in the next 24 hours, we're going to change their life completely? And the other bit was, no one really knew whether we'd all survive, right? I mean, you then start thinking about, your family, your kids, what's going to happen next? Are we all going to, will sort of aliens come into, this place and think, well, this is how they lived until the pandemic hit?
Yeah.
So they were the really frightening moments. The other moment was when I was made vaccine minister.
Yeah.
Where I was one of the few people, obviously, who could travel around the country because I had to. So I turned my ground floor in my home as my office, and then I had to go to obviously NHS headquarters, number 10, Department of Health, and I walked down Piccadilly one evening, and heading to one of the meetings in Whitehall. And there was no one there. I walked in the middle of the road, right? And there wasn't even a police car.
Ghost town.
everything was boarded
Like
up
from a-
or
like from a
closed
movie.
down.
28 days later.
Yeah.
No,
That's
literally,
what I'm thinking.
28 days. I was about to say,
Mm.
28 days. I was looking around thinking, is this the end?
Yeah.
Right? Is this where, as I say, a new life form will come down and go, actually, this is where they lived.
Can I ask? You mentioned about risks and being a founder and CEO, decisions and how you make decisions. That is the most critical part. And like you said earlier, don't mess around with the small ones, the noise. Figure out the really important key ones, and I suppose also the hierarchy of how those decisions are made. In a room like you were in that you just described, where you have to make a decision about we're going to do a lockdown. Can you just explain to us, how does a decision like that get made? Is it Boris up? Are you taking a vote together? Is everyone pitching in? Is there time for that? Like, I'd love to literally know, we've got boardroom
fascinating,
experience,
yeah.
but what is the experience of that? An actual decision that affects the entire country. How is it made and how quickly?
The important bits of government is we can pull in experts and data, right? And everybody's view around the table was we have to listen to Chris Whitty, right, the chief medical officer, and they present first, and then the virologists will talk to us about what they think they know about the virus from their opposite numbers in China and in Europe, and we then question the data, question the presentation, and then come to a decision at the end, which usually the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so who runs the Cabinet Office, I was CDL for a while under Liz, might chair this. So I chaired all the Cobra meetings, bar the first one for the funeral for Her Majesty. So we'd have a Cobra meeting every afternoon with every cabinet minister around the table, and we go through. It was like organising the Olympics in 11 days, basically.
That's crazy.
And then you'd make a decision. You say, look, the first lockdown was actually, in many ways, probably the easiest decision because no one knew, right, how lethal this virus is.
Yeah, and this is risk reward.
Right, and we had no vaccine and no protection against it. And therefore, it would be completely irresponsible to just say, hey, let's do nothing on this and see where we land. And then, once we got to a place where, we knew a little bit more about it, the biggest concern or the determinant of decision is at which point does the NHS break, right? Yep. And one of the things you have to sort of worry about is, okay, if we don't try and slow it down, will the NHS break? And then obviously cause many more deaths. But then as we got into our stride and scaled the vaccination program, it certainly for me, it became an easy decision to push back and say we don't need another lockdown, because if you look at all right? Why should the next model be much worse than the ones in terms of real world outcome?
But coming back to the question in the room, is it Chris Whitty? Is it Boris?
No, it goes back to the Prime Minister or
Boris still has to make the final
to the lead
decision.
minister in the room.
Yeah.
Who will then say, look, obviously now we've heard from everyone. Here's the recommendation. So what happens is, the civil service do a lot of work beforehand.
Yep.
So you've got a lot of papers in front of you with different options.
Yep.
And then you debate those options, and then you arrive at an outcome as to which option you're all comfortable going with.
What did you guys think of Sweden and their policy? Like, it's just the opposite approach. It's fascinating, right?
So yeah, and actually, if you look at what happened with Omicron, right, where when we took the decision not to lock down and say, actually, we're going to warn people to be careful in terms of visiting elderly during the holiday period and so on, people then self-regulated. Plus, we had the confidence that the vaccine program has pretty much delivered what it needs to deliver. And back to what I was just saying to you, my argument in cabinet for that particular is to say, actually, if you look at the modelling versus real-world outcomes, at every stage historically, right, we've come out of the best, at the sort of the most optimistic range of the model, and therefore, why should it be any different this time? Right? And therefore, if the NHS is not going to break, and we are the most optimistic end of the model for Omicron, yes, it's more infectious, but it's much less lethal, then we shouldn't lock down.